The vast Soviet Warplane fleet, once a symbol of power, was left in limbo after World War II. As the USSR shifted from wartime urgency to peacetime rebuilding, diese once die aircraft became obsolete, facing the harsh reality of decommissioning. Thousands of planes, built under immense pressure, would never see combat again. Instead, they were abandoned, dismantled, and melted down, forgotten by a nation eager to move forward. But in the shadow of this forgotten fleet, what was left of the Soviet Union's aerial might? The remnants tell a story of economic necessity, technological advancement, and a world that had changed forever. After the end of World War II, thousands of Soviet warplanes, each a testament to the immense industrial effort and wartime desperation of the Soviet Union, were suddenly left with no place in the world. The war was over, the Soviet machine was transitioning from wartime urgency to peacetime stability, and these aircraft, once symbols of Soviet might, were now obsolete relics. But what happened to them? How did an air force that had once been the backbone of Soviet strategy now deal with the overwhelming surplus of aircraft they no longer needed? In 1945, the USSR had amassed a fleet of warplanes that numbered in the thousands. Some estimates suggest the number of Soviet combat aircraft at the war's end was well over 100,000. The sheer scale of this number is staggering, but it tells only part of the story. These planes were designed for a purpose: to defend the vast Soviet territory and to engage the Axis powers, primarily Nazi Germany, in battle. With that purpose suddenly gone, the need for such a large fleet vanished almost overnight. The planes themselves were built under immense wartime pressure. Rapid production lines, often in hastily constructed factories, had churned out these machines at a pace unseen in peacetime. While many were state-of-the-art for their time, others were less reliable, hastily designed to meet the pressing needs of the war. As the war ended, they no longer had a clear role. Many were obsolete, outdated by both the end of the conflict and the rapid advancements in aviation technology that came with the end of the war. The scale of this surplus was not just a logistical issue but an economic one as well. The Soviet economy, battered by years of war, was now tasked with reintegrating millions of people into the workforce and rebuilding entire sectors. The sudden need to manage a glut of unused warplanes added a heavy burden. There was simply no space or resources to keep all these planes operational. At the same time, the economic toll of maintaining them was unsustainable. Soviet planners had to quickly make difficult decisions: what to do with these thousands of warplanes, many of which were already outdated and would only lose value with time? The immediate response from the Soviet government was not to destroy the fleet outright but to let time and necessity do the work. Some aircraft were indeed scrapped in the immediate aftermath of the war, but this was not a widespread solution. Instead, many planes were simply parked, left to gather dust in hangars across the Soviet Union. Some were abandoned in remote airfields, out of sight and out of mind, to become forgotten monuments to a past era. The Soviet Union's vast territory offered plenty of space for such aircraft to be left in limbo, slowly decaying. In the early post-war years, the USSR's priorities shifted. Military spending was reduced as the focus moved from war to reconstruction. The demand for large-scale military hardware fell dramatically. A new generation of Soviet leaders began to realize that air combat had evolved, and the old planes, though impressive in their time, were no longer suited for the modern age of warfare. Meanwhile, there were other planes being produced, more advanced models like the Yakovlev Yak-15 and the MiG-15, which were better suited to the needs of the Soviet military going forward. These newer planes began to replace their older counterparts, accelerating the process of obsolescence. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Soviet leadership had begun to rethink its entire approach to military aviation. As tensions between the USSR and the West intensified, the need for more advanced, more specialized aircraft became urgent. The Soviet Union was no longer interested in maintaining a massive fleet of older planes that had no place in the coming Cold War landscape. The transition was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The need to conserve resources and focus on new weapons technology meant that the vast majority of the warplanes of the World War II era would never fly again. What followed was an extensive process of scrapping and dismantling. Thousands of planes were taken apart, their metal melted down to be repurposed for other industries. Engines, weapons, and other key components were removed, often for use in new projects. The metals and materials, once invaluable to the wartime effort, were now seen as raw resources to be recycled for the rebuilding effort. It was an efficient but cold process. The machinery of war, once a symbol of national pride, was reduced to scrap to fuel the next stage of Soviet industry. Yet, not all aircraft were scrapped immediately. Some were sold off or repurposed for other, less glamorous uses. A number of Soviet warplanes found their way into civilian service, often in an entirely different capacity. A few of the older models were converted into crop-dusting planes or used for training purposes. Others, particularly the more iconic aircraft, were kept in storage, preserved as historical artifacts. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. For the most part, the planes were either forgotten or melted down, leaving behind only a few remnants of a once proud air force. For the Soviet Union, the fate of its wartime planes became an unfortunate symbol of the broader transformation of the country after World War II. The war had reshaped Soviet society, and the aircraft that had helped secure its victory were now part of a past that had to be discarded to make way for the future. The economic pressures, the need to modernize, and the drive for efficiency meant that what was once a cornerstone of Soviet power was now an inconvenient legacy. But not all of the planes met such a final fate. Some, particularly the more advanced or notable models, found their way to museums, where they became symbols of the Soviet Union's wartime triumph. These planes, carefully preserved and displayed for future generations, served as a reminder of a time when the Soviet Union's air force had been one of the most formidable in the world. These relics, housed in museums across the former Soviet states, stand as silent witnesses to a different era, when the sky was full of warplanes and the world was at war. For the vast majority, however, their fate was one of slow abandonment, silent destruction, or silent obscurity. The process of decommissioning these warplanes was not an event, but a gradual, almost inevitable decline. They became part of the industrial and military waste of a country that had to move on from its wartime past and embrace a new, uncertain future. The fate of Soviet warplanes after the war stands as a sobering reminder of the cost of war and the inexorable march of time. Machines built for one purpose, then rendered useless by changing political and economic realities, were cast aside without ceremony. The vast scale of this disposal is almost incomprehensible. Thousands of aircraft, representing not just Soviet engineering but a chapter in history, simply disappeared. But the true scale of this loss, its broader consequences, is still unfolding. The fate of thousands of Soviet warplanes after World War II was not a single event but a prolonged, inevitable process shaped by the intersecting pressures of politics, economics, and technological advancement. The bulk of these aircraft, once symbols of Soviet military prowess, faced a fate of obsolescence and disposal. The drive for modernization in the wake of the war meant that these planes, designed for an era now past, were swiftly rendered unnecessary. Yet, the sheer scale of their abandonment, repurposing, or destruction sheds light on a significant, often overlooked chapter of history. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union, emerging from the ashes of war, was confronting not only the physical toll of combat but also the challenge of rebuilding a shattered economy. The war had left the Soviet Union in ruins, millions of lives lost, entire cities obliterated, and critical industries decimated. The Soviet leadership's immediate focus was on reconstruction, but the presence of a massive surplus of warplanes, many of which had never seen battle, created a new dilemma. The material cost of maintaining these aircraft was staggering. The resources to continue operating them were now simply too precious to waste on planes that no longer fit the vision of the future Soviet military. To understand the monumental task of dealing with these surplus aircraft, it's important to first consider the scope of the Soviet aviation effort during the war. The Soviet Union had produced an overwhelming number of aircraft throughout the conflict, roughly 170,000 combat aircraft, including bombers, fighters, and transport planes. This massive production effort had been part of a wartime strategy to outproduce the Axis powers and ensure that the Soviet Union could wage a prolonged and devastating air campaign. But by the end of the war, this great supply had outlived its purpose. The rapid shift from wartime mobilization to peacetime economy created a paradox. The same factories that had produced these planes were now tasked with manufacturing consumer goods, agricultural equipment, and rebuilding the infrastructure of the devastated Soviet cities. The need for military aircraft, and specifically the need for a massive air force, was no longer immediate. The newly established Cold War dynamics, characterized by a terrifying arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, would soon shape the future of military aviation, but the immediate post-war years were a time of financial and political tightening. This forced the Soviet leadership into a difficult decision: what to do with the rapidly aging fleet of warplanes that had been rushed into production to meet the needs of the conflict. Many of these aircraft, particularly the older models, were now seen as a waste of limited resources. The Soviet Union, facing widespread shortages of critical materials, simply could not afford to keep them in service. Even though many of these aircraft were still capable of flying, their utility was increasingly questioned. With modern jet aircraft already entering service and new designs rapidly advancing, the older piston-engine planes of World War II seemed increasingly redundant. However, the decision to scrap or abandon these planes wasn't an immediate one. For a brief period after the war, many of the aircraft were placed into storage, left untouched in vast airfields and hangars, left to rot or decay with the passage of time. These storage sites, scattered across the Soviet Union, became veritable graveyards for thousands of planes. Some were stored in large, state-run facilities, while others were simply parked in open fields, sometimes covered in tarps to protect them from the harsh Russian winters. The hope was that, in time, some of these aircraft might still prove useful in another conflict. But as years passed, it became increasingly clear that the Soviet leadership had no intention of returning to the practices of wartime mobilization. The disposal of Soviet warplanes did not happen all at once but rather over a series of years. While some of the aircraft were repurposed for civilian uses, such as crop dusting or training, the majority of the fleet was decommissioned. It was a quiet process, devoid of the fanfare that had accompanied their creation during the war. These planes were not simply left to gather dust, they were systematically dismantled. Engines, landing gear, and other usable components were salvaged and recycled. The metal from the planes was melted down and used to feed the ever-growing industrial needs of the post-war Soviet Union. This recycling of aircraft metal was not just an economic necessity but a reflection of the central planning system that sought to extract value from every possible resource. The rapid pace of technological development during the Cold War era made many of the older Soviet warplanes increasingly obsolete. While jet engines and advanced radar technology became the backbone of the Soviet Air Force in the 1950s, the piston-engine fighters and bombers of the World War II era were left behind. Planes like the Yakovlev Yak-3, the Ilyushin Il-2, and the Lavochkin La-5, once among the best in the world, were suddenly seen as relics of a bygone era. In many cases, these planes were stripped of their most valuable components and discarded, their remains sent to scrapyards or converted into training devices. For the few aircraft that remained, their fate was often less certain. Some found new lives as museum pieces, displayed in Air Force museums in Moscow or other major Soviet cities. These preserved planes became symbols of Soviet resilience and military might, relics of the war that had defined an entire generation. But for every one plane carefully preserved, thousands were abandoned or destroyed. The effort to keep these planes as part of the Soviet Union's heritage was, in many ways, a token gesture, designed to preserve the memory of the Great Patriotic War rather than the aircraft themselves. These planes, now encased in glass and steel, are the closest many of us will ever come to understanding the scale of the wartime air effort. However, not all of these planes were forgotten. Some were sold or given away to foreign countries, particularly to newly formed socialist republics that were still building up their own military forces. These planes often found themselves in the hands of smaller nations that lacked the resources to produce their own advanced aircraft. Some of these planes were put into service, albeit in less demanding roles. A few made their way into the hands of private collectors or were even repurposed for commercial aviation. But these instances were rare, and for the most part, Soviet warplanes from the World War II era vanished from the skies as quickly as they had appeared. In some cases, the Soviet Union also made the decision to store certain aircraft as a form of strategic reserve. These planes were kept in isolated, hard-to-reach locations, often hidden in remote corners of the vast Soviet Union, just in case they were needed in the future. Yet, as the decades passed, it became increasingly clear that these aircraft were unlikely to ever fly again. The Cold War brought new forms of military engagement, and by the 1960s, Soviet military planners were no longer interested in preserving relics of the past. The reality of nuclear warfare had made traditional air combat seem obsolete. The planes that had once roamed the skies of Europe during the war now served only as a reminder of a time that was fading into history. Ultimately, the fate of the thousands of Soviet warplanes that once filled the skies of Europe and the Soviet Union was one of gradual obsolescence, replacement, and scrapping. The Soviet Union, driven by the harsh realities of post-war reconstruction, could not afford to keep these planes in active service. What was once an impressive fleet of aircraft was slowly and inexorably dismantled, each plane contributing a small part to the rebuilding of a war-torn nation. The last vestiges of these aircraft can still be found today, in museums and private collections, and in the memories of those who flew them.